you see, they made a path for visitors in the Kidron Valley, and the interesting thing about the Kidron Valley is it's very unique, very sacred. People started to bury their dead there, and all around Jerusalem basically, but a lot in the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives, because of the proximity to the Temple Mount. Because according to the prophets, this is the place where God will give the judgment at the end of time. So when you're talking about resurrection of the dead, people want to be as close as they can to the judgment place for one reason or another. Okay, so this is some of the impressive monumental graves in the Kidron Valley. This monument, until this very day, is known as Absalom's hand. In 2 Samuel 18:18 we read, "Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called that pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument." Now I wish I could have told you that all the signs of the research signifies that this is it. But unfortunately it will not be the truth, because archaeologically this monument is dated to about 1,000 years after the time of Absalom. But for as long as we can remember, this is called and known as Absalom's hand. And it's all part of the Kidron Valley. But before we continue with our story, I want to talk about who were Jesus' real enemies were. The issue of who exactly instigated and carried out the plot against Jesus has been misconstrued by the Roman Church. Blaming all Jews for this is a misconception that has been used to justify blood libels, persecutions, pogroms, and general demonization directed against Jews. Just a simple anti-Semitic falsehood. There was very well-known and used statement, the Jews cried, "Hosanna, Hosanna," on Friday and "Crucify, Crucify" on Sunday. This hate doctrine presented Jesus and his disciples as more Gentile-like, not as true Jews, but rather detached from their environment, culture, and people. When Jesus locked horns with Pharisees, he usually did so within the ongoing internal Jewish debate of the era, dealing mostly with two issues that hadn't been finalized at that point in time. One, what exactly is obedient Shabbat observance and where the line is crossed into disobedience. Second, what represents ritual impurity and what infects it. Further disputes between Pharisees and Jesus are over interpretations of the oral Torah. This type of internal debate among Jews was typical in its day. Even now, in modern times, Orthodox Jewish men heatedly debate points of oral ruling in every yeshiva. It's an ancient style of study that still exists in our time. It is of critical importance to be able to distinguish between this form of heated debate to a real hatred. Those few understandings with everything we recently learned about the Pharisees leaves us with an absolute conclusion. Pharisees were no enemies of Jesus. Now the question rises, who then? Some scholars have referred to a trinity of evil present in Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. 1. Rome, with its provocative and avaricious governors. 2. The privileged elites of Jerusalem society, whose position and wealth were safeguarded by their cooperation with Rome. And 3. Sadducee high priestly families, who held sway in the religious life of the city and controlled the temple treasury and the street prices around the temple complex. The immoral levels of profit at the expense of the pilgrims by the chief priests and elders, as they repeatedly referred to in the Gospels, served a dual purpose: to line their own pockets, but also to make generous contributions to the Roman governor, who in return would maintain their position of privilege. A considerable number of criticism and condemnations of these people is recorded in Jewish writings from that era. All three synoptic gospels are consistent in these accounts relating to the chief priests, elders, and scribes, with never a mention of a Pharisee from the moment the plot against Jesus was hatched. Even in Jesus' birth time, the scripture tells us who is in power and of influence. Matthew 2:3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And in Jesus' missionary, Matthew 16:21, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. And in Matthew 20:18-19, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify. Jesus always knew how exactly he's going to meet his end and by the hands of whom. But there is a turning point that puts Jesus on the radar of this small elite clique. So the moment that Jesus is getting on the radar of that small group that we mentioned is the moment that he overturned the table of the money changers. Matthew 17:12. Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. Now, a further explanation is required here. Jews and Gentiles from all the corners of the Roman Empire came to Jerusalem at the appointed times. They were required to pay half a shekel of silver for the upkeeping of the temple. That is a commandment given by God. Exodus 30:13. This is what everyone among those who are numbered shall give. Half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. A shekel is a 20 gerahs. A half a shekel shall be an offering to the Lord. Everyone included among those who are numbered from 20 years old and above shall give an offering to the Lord. Not only did Jesus knew and had no problem with it, we read that he paid it himself. Matthew 17:24. When they had come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" Peter said to him, "From strangers." Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. And when you have opened its mouth, you will find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and for you." From this, we understand that Jesus didn't think he needed to pay the tax for the temple. Not because he didn't believe in paying the tax for the temple, but because he is the Son of God, and the Son of God should not pay tax for the temple for God. But he decides to go ahead and pay it to at this point of time, not to withdraw an unnecessary attention. So he sends Simon to retrieve, by a miracle of course, the coin to make sure that he pays for both of them. Now, since we mentioned all of that, we might as well bring up another interesting anecdote. All of Jesus' disciples were under the age of 20, except Simon. When we read the verses we just did, it explains itself. A rabbi was always responsible to cover all the needs or financial needs of his disciples. So Jesus does exactly that. He pays the tax for himself and for Simon, the only disciple that is above the age of 20. If you remember, we read from Exodus, the tax that people are obligated to pay is only above the age of 20. Now back to our point. So why did Jesus turn over the tables? Not because they were collecting the tax, but because of the exorbitant rates of exchange from which the elders and Jerusalem priesthood fill their pockets through their proxies, the money changers. You see, people came from different places. They had to change their money in order to pay the half shekel. And of course, the rates for the sacrifices animal was also way too high. That was what Jesus was upset with. Once Jesus disrupted the equilibrium of Jerusalem's privileged few in the temple area by affecting their pockets, Jesus placed himself firmly in their awareness as a threat due to his popularity among the people. We can see it in the scripture. In Matthew 26, starting from verse 1, "Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished all this saying, that he said to his disciples, 'You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified.' Then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." It is clear that this small group that plotted to eliminate Jesus feared the vast number of regular Jews. For example, in Luke 19 again, 47, the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him and were unable to do anything, for all the people were very attentive to hear him. And another example is in Luke 22:2, "And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people." Now there are more examples that distinguish between this little group that plotted against Jesus and the rest of the Jews. Now we understand why they had to come to arrest him in the middle of the night. It is important to clarify that the Sanhedrin that gathered in Caiaphas' house in the middle of the night was not the full Sanhedrin. This was the middle of the night of a Passover, and they were exhausted from holding courts all day in smaller groups of 23 members in different places in the city. Now the evidence in the Gospels as how through his preaching and healing many thousands came to believe in him, at the very least as a prophet, is overwhelming. They were all Jews, and so were his disciples. And none of them, nor the Pharisees, had nothing in common with those privileged few supporters of Rome who sought to eliminate him. His execution was carried out by Roman soldiers under the orders of a Roman governor, as nobody else had the authority to order such an execution. The plot to eliminate him was the work of a very small, entirely corrupt group that thrived under Roman rule while being loathed by the Jewish masses. To summarize this part of Jesus' true enemies, the quote mentioned earlier, "The Jews cried, 'Hosanna, Hosanna' on Friday and 'Crucify, Crucify' on Sunday," can seen as no more than an anti-Semitic slur with no basis in fact. The large Jewish crowds of simple folk shouting Hosanna had nothing to do with the small privileged clique shouting Crucify a few days later. The reality is that after Rome took control of the church in the 4th century, they went to great lengths in teaching and writing to remove all responsibility for the crucifixion from Rome and divert blame to the Jews in general. The Roman rulers and the small Sadducee elite were the true enemies of Jesus, not the Pharisee, and certainly not the Jewish masses who followed him everywhere. There were 3 different phases of formal Jewish education in this period of time known as the Second Temple era. The first one was Bet Sefer, which literally translates to the house of the book. Which book? One might ask. So it's obviously the Torah. the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also known as the Pentateuch. Those schools didn't include subjects such as geography, history, mathematics, science, music, etc. The education consisted solely of repetitive readings of the Torah, those 5 books we just mentioned, to memorize it by rote. Endless repetition divided into weekly portions known as parasha, stretching over a year, the festival of the booths, until the festival of the booths a year after. Now, this phase started from the time the child could speak properly till the age of 7 or 8. And this school level was taught by a regular Bible teacher. The second level, from the age of 8 to 11, was the Bet Midrash, the middle school. And at this point, the students would study the books of prophets and writings, including learning about the concept of Messiah for the first time in their life, or formally for the first time in their life. And the third level, the third phase of the educational system back then, was Bet Talmud, the high school, only till the age of 13, the age of Bar Mitzvah. Basically, at this point, they started learning about oral Torah, entirely on the basis of questions and answers. Students were simply presented with the Torah commandments, and they were encouraged to argue their meanings and how to obey these commandments. This open-mindedness of teaching opposing opinions, which makes students think for themselves whilst memorizing rulings, is a system still used today in yeshivot around the world. I mean, think about it for a second. How did Jesus responded to his interlocutors and disciples? He answered each of their questions with another question. This is a classic rabbinical Jewish style instituted by the Pharisees and designed to make the student think for themselves. The 10 lost tribes, or the 10 tribes of Israel. But to be more accurate, it's actually 8.5 tribes. So let's figure it out together. So we have in the Judean territory, now we have 2 different kingdoms, Judah, the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. We know that in the Judean territory we have the Judah tribe, obviously, but we also have Shimon or Simeon, half of the Benjamin tribe. Okay, so that's 2.5 already. But how did I end up with 8.5? There's one tribe, the Levi tribe, that they don't have a specific territory. They are spread among all the tribes of Israel in refugee cities. They need to be among all people. So the Levi tribe is not really in one specific location. It's all around the territory of Israel and Judah. This tribe is out of the equation. So it's 8.5 tribes in the kingdom of Israel. Now Elijah spent the night over there at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, and the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now, in the next few verses, I'm going to read you the English version of it, but I'm going to explain a mistranslation that I think is critical for the understanding. "Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper." Now, the words of this part, "a gentle whisper," is maybe different from one version to another as far as English translations of the Bible, but we never found the accurate one that truly gives the real translation. In Hebrew, what they translated as a gentle whisper is actually kol dmama daka, which translate to absolute stillness and silence, which actually gives us a whole new perspective of this moment. It's not that God suddenly appeared in a very little small voice. The opposite is the truth. God showed up, appeared, started talking to Elijah after a moment of complete silence and stillness in the desert. I don't know if you ever got the opportunity of hiking in the desert by yourself. I got a chance of doing that. I love doing things like that. And being in a desert, in the middle of nowhere, with no signs whatsoever of civilization, and you get a moment of quiet, this is probably the closest you can get to God in some perspective, or at least how some people view it. In many cases, when people trying to find a way to God, in Judaism there's something we call lehitboded, to go and be completely with yourself. And if you can, if it's possible, you want to try to do it in a place that no one is around, that you can even yell without seeming completely lunatic, yell to God your frustrations, your anger, your love to God, whatever. But it's crucial to understand that in this case, this mistranslation, this misaccuracy does harm to the understanding of the verse. And God is actually trying to send a message to Elijah, because Elijah was very outgoing, very zealot, very extreme with his action. I'm alone, the prophet. I am the only man. Let's kill all the prophets of the Baal, slay them by the swords. So he's very extreme. That's why I keep saying in some people's perspective, he's a controversial character. So God is teaching him. God is not in the earthquake. God is not in the movement of the earth. He's not in the fire. Kol dmama daka. Absolute silence and stillness. The other thing that's worth mentioning is Joseph. I mean, it's still some of those stories that we briefly mentioned, but Joseph was also such a strong believer that he realized whatever happens, supposed to happen. So even if my brothers, my own flesh and blood, sold me to slavery, this was meant to be. This was the doing of God. And this is easy to say, but to actually live that way of thinking in our own life, it's very, very hard. When someone does to us something that it's like we see as like bad or like evil or something, it's hard to accept that as a doing of God. But if you are a believer, and most of you or all of you are believers, that's basically what it is. Everything comes from above. Everything comes from God. When Barak decided to act upon his lack of faith and ask for Deborah to join him to make sure that he has God in his back, he actually lost the fame in one way or another. Now, I'm not judging Barak. I just want to use this story to remind ourselves that we are just human. I mean, the forces of Sisera on paper, when you look at it, the people of Israel had no chance against them. So Barak, showing his humane characteristics, only makes sense. And we all run into situations in our life that we experience doubt, lack of faith, fear. So we're not perfect, we're human. And in these moments, we need to find the Deborah that is within us and overcome this.